So let's see, I thought this was a pretty fascinating section. I really liked his discussion of disorder and what he thinks disorder really is, and how it's, disorder from one perspective looks like order from the other. The one thing I mean, that all made sense to me. The one thing that I was not sure I agreed with him, and this may just because I don't understand, is when he's talking about, disorder from one perspective looks like order from the other and vice versa. That did not seem to take into account the idea of entropy and sort of the ultimate heat death, possibly, of the universe. But then much later in this section, like on page 243, he actually deals with that. But it didn't seem to me that his dismissal of that notion of disorder was very effective. But then I'm also not sure I understand his critique, his critique of it very well. So I could be just misunderstanding. But my general sense, and again, the way he describes it on page 243 sounds to me like, what I've heard is that entropy over time is supposed to increase in the universe and increase and increase and increase, and then eventually it would reach a steady state of some perfectly homogeneous state of energy, where nothing's changing anymore. It's not like zero energy. There's energy there, but it's perfectly homogeneous and perfectly well distributed and even, and that's heat death, because there is nothing happening. It's just this, it's like the ocean suddenly going flat. And in that situation, I don't know what it would look like in terms of like fundamental particles and stuff. I don't know, but there wouldn't be any stars or planets or living things. It would just be this kind of blah. And that's kind of and he does, on 243, he says this is if what I'm saying now is actually what he's talking about with this, when he talks about entropy, it seems to be very close to what he's describing. And the difference between that notion of what he calls degradation and the other one is, if you can have two different types of order. This is what he talks about earlier, and it's just a matter of perspective. Well, I consider this order because this is consistent with my intentions, and I consider that disorder because it doesn't represent my intentions. But this, what he calls this entropy, he says, is the most metaphysical of them. It's least dependent on convention, and sort of, which I take to mean it's least dependent on this notion of having one of two perspectives. So it seems to me it's a possible challenge to his concept of disorder. I just don't understand that his response, does a good job of dismissing that. On 244, he says something about an infinite universe. I don't really know what he means there, and I don't know why that would be a criticism of this notion of entropy. He describes what's on 244, what seems to me describes the Big Bang. It might be supposed that the general instability had arisen from a general state of stability, and so on. And then later on, he seems to say Boltzmann thinks this is mathematically improbable. I assume that that's the Big Bang or something like it. But then today, that seems to be actually the sort of scientific orthodoxy. So anyway, that seemed to me the biggest challenge to his notion of disorder. His conception of disorder would be this notion of disorder as not just a different kind of order, but an actual homeostasis of energy death.
And now this is just, I guess, me being kind of a smart aleck, but isn't ultimate homeostasis of all energy kind of like an order of physical, like a physical order? And not, I mean, in the sense that there are two types of order, right? There's the vital or willed order, and the physical or automatic order. And isn't the heat death like
Well,
the
he seems to accept this. I mean, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but he seems to accept this notion of entropy as actually falling outside of his other notion of disorder as these two things. He, like I said, he says this one is not dependent on convention. In this less precise form, it becomes independent of convention. This is on 243. It is the most metaphysical of the laws of physics, since it points out without interposed symbols, without artificial devices of measurement, the direction in which the world is going. So he seems to accept this as an alternate, as not another example of, but as an alternative to his dual perspective notion of disorder.
So I think at least what he's saying with the infinite universe thing, he's critiquing that idea. So he's saying
Right,
that some people,
I don't understand his critique.
You don't?
Oh, no, I don't. Well, one thing, I don't know what he means by infinite universe, because, for one thing, there's the notion of, so, Einstein initially said the universe was, how does this go? Infinite yet bounded. But the idea was that, you had the space-time capsule, and that where space and time and matter all came into being at once, and it was this enclosed thing, and you can't talk about outside of it. I've heard people say recently that now there's physicists think there's a possibility that there is a real infinite spatial domain. So I don't know what he means by infinite, by infinite universe. If he means like a giant time box that is waiting to be, what I mean?
Yeah, so he says
the Einsteinian thing, or what?
So he's basically saying one hypothesis to refute the idea of entropy is that there's really just an infinite universe, that entropy works in a closed system, but in this case it would be if it's infinite. But he's critiquing the idea that there is an infinite universe, and he says that basically to speak of an infinite universe is to admit a perfect coincidence of matter with abstract space, and consequently an absolute externality of all the parts of matter in relation to one another. So that's, the geometric phase space in a sense. But then he says basically that doesn't make any sense if you have this absolute notion of, it's almost like a Newtonian idea of space in which everything is external from each other, and if space is an absolute, then these things that are, separated in space are separated absolutely. But then he makes the case that, well, we actually have to have relations within each other, that one thing always has to be able to relate to every other thing to some degree, and therefore those contradict each other. Basically, that's a kind of idealization of it, the idea of this abstract infinite space.
But I don't think that kind of entropy as heat death or as ultimate disorganization requires an infinite universe.
No, that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying that the idea of an infinite universe as a contradiction against entropy doesn't work. And so he has a kind of a different answer where he's basically saying, so I don't think he's really necessarily saying that entropy is wrong or anything like that. He's saying more so that, I don't remember him necessarily kind of critiquing it at all. He's just saying that life basically works within entropy by kind of delaying it, by, accumulating energy in these unique ways, and then being able to release that energy in like strategic ways. So I don't think he's denying entropy or anything like that. And I think that's why he says basically that, you know, it's the most metaphysical of all these things. And that has to do with so when he talks about convention, he's talking about basically measurement and units of measurement, quantification. That would be, you know, this kind of artificial way of kind of segmenting things, which he is critiquing those other ideas that are dependent on quantification and measurement. But he likes entropy because he says that it's talking about movements. It's a quality of movement. And then he's saying that life is basically a kind of delay of that movement, I guess. But then, so I don't have a problem with that, except it's kind of hard to understand exactly how his other idea of movement kind of works within that, because it seems like he has the opposite quality with this kind of more general movement. I think he would say more general movement with duration and its concentration, and then its relaxation, its extension towards space, where it seems like there's something like they're kind of opposite in a way. I'm not totally sure. Maybe I need to just like think about that more. But yeah.
Do you guys think that he talks about this idea from Aristotle of like a movement being like a weight that falls, like a stone falling into place and returning back to the place where it belongs or whatever. And on 245, right after he talks a lot about kind of extension and it's just right after he talked about entropy and stuff, he says, the vision we have of the material world is that of a weight which falls. No image drawn from matter, properly so called, will ever give us the idea of the weight rising. But the conclusion will come home to us with still greater force if we press nearer to the concrete reality, and if we consider no longer only matter in general, but within this matter living bodies. So I think that it's my perspective that entropy is kind of, in a way, this image of a weight falling down, of like, you know, eventually we will be, like everything will be even and no life will exist because, you know, there will be no, like the weight essentially will have fallen down in its place. And that life is, like Chase said, like an interruption of that. It's a thing that kind of actively fights entropy and raises the stone higher rather than letting it fall. But it never successfully pushes the stone upward. It just applies some pressure so the stone falls down slower. And so that was my conception of kind of what entropy was to him, and then not how it's a problem necessarily, but how life perhaps is that disorder. That entropy is a sort of order. It's the second of the two orders, and that the disorder is life, or this pushing up on this weight of the stone.
But if so, you guys think that entropy may be the other kind of order. I was thinking that entropy was a sort of a criticism of his dual order thing, because at least in the sense, you know, he said like one of the criticisms of his view would be that there is only one kind of stuff and it's just always falling apart. But then he says that can't be because I don't remember why. But why couldn't that be the case? I mean, why couldn't you say, so like in my, you know, not very, you know, Madeline might be willing to critique me if I make a mistake here, but, you know, my understanding is that, you know, the idea is you have the Big Bang, you get this all this stuff happening, and then over a vast expanse of time, all that energy that is lumpy and discontinuous and, you know, creates suns and planets and bodies and things, that over time that all just evens out and flattens out. And so it doesn't seem like on that conception you would need two opposing things. You just need one, you know, a bunch of stuff with a whole bunch of energy, and over time that energy just flattens out and becomes homogeneous. And it doesn't seem that kind of thing needs a dual aspect notion of disorder. You just got like order, or at least potential order, and lumpiness and discontinuity, and then eventually you get absolute homogeneous continuity. It's, you know, at the far end. So it seems to me that's a possible interpretation of disorder that he either doesn't consider or that he dismisses somehow.
I think he's dismissing it as disorder. I don't think he sees it as disorder. I think he sees it as, I think he sees it as a sort of order, but something very different from what, I think what he's basically trying to argue is that what we think of disorder is actually just another form of order. And that the dualism between order and disorder are actually two forms of order. And to reach disorder is to, in a sense, go between these two types of order and find the interruption between them. Find the thing that while you're moving between them or while you're trying to understand them, there are these interruptions, these things that kind of stop us from fully kind of existing in either realm of order. And so to me, like, I think he is critical of entropy as an idea of disorder, and that he is trying to argue that it is a form of order, and that when we're talking about disorder as the absence of order, often we're not talking about it, like he's arguing that we're not talking about it as the absence of order, we're just talking about it as a different type of order. And to get to the absence of order is this process of dialectics and understanding what, you know, this idea of the weight and pushing up on the weight, interruption, just kind of all these ideas that are seem like metaphors to me for what he thinks disorder actually is. Because, I mean, just from without having any understanding of entropy, to me it sounds like a kind of order. I mean, the fact that it's working towards kind of evening out all these lumps of energy, to me, in a sense, is an order. You know, it's working towards something, and even if it's not deterministic or finalist in any way, it's working towards kind of evening everything out, which to me is the sort of order.
Yeah, actually, before I wanted to add on to that. It seemed to me, and maybe this is, I guess, where we're each kind of having like a slightly different reading of the text, but like, it seemed to me that he was insistent throughout a good portion of the text that the notion of disorder barely exists at all. And not the notion of disorder, but disorder as a thing in itself. And he made some, I don't know where, but I have it in my notes right here. But I'm sure we can all remember when he's talking about oscillating between the two forms, the vitalist, willed order, like a clean room, and the physical automatic order, which includes the way that the world is, and the way that the universe is, and the way that solid objects hold together, and entropy, and all that. All of the mechanical processes of physical reality at all, that is included in order number 2. The first is the willed order, which is the order that it has some sort of conscientious movement to it, like cleaning a room or keeping a weight up in the air. But he says that the disorder that we point to is almost just verbal at a certain point. You know, that we never quite jump to a real total disorder or incoherence, right? And that the notion of not the notion of the thing, but the notion of the thing being disorderly. The notion of the idea that this thing that we're looking at, this other side of the coin, is disorder, that is perspectival, I think. That is relative. That is contingent. But I don't think that, like, I think that the process itself, the what does he call it? The tendency of energy to resolve itself into heat and to spread itself across bodies. I don't know if that's on, I bet 224 to 226, when he's talking about that. But I don't know if that is necessarily breaking away from his notion of order and disorder. Because you can order, or not, you can kind of systematize the notion of entropy into it's not necessarily a duality either of two types of order. I kind of want to make that stand here. I don't know if he's really saying that there's only two types of order that exist. I think he's just saying that anytime you try to jump into different orders and call things disorderly and make these statements about what is and isn't order, you're always trapped in some kind of order. You're always going to be doing it from some kind of order. And I think that includes our being as this series of discontinuities, like you said, and its arrival, its kind of slow degradation into this sort of entropy of uniformity and continuity. I understand what you're saying, that entropy is a form of degradation that is not, in his words, is not necessarily perspectival, right, or relative. It's just metaphysical. It's more metaphysical. But I think that I don't know if that necessarily blows the hole into the theory that I think that it seems like it might, based on it jumping out of this perspectival thing. But I think that maybe he's saying that our perspectival notion of order, all of it exists in this material realm that is covered in entropy, or that is kind of dominated or ruled by the law of entropy, or the physical law of entropy, in some sense. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong though.
To build off that, on 234 he talks about feelings. He says he's talking about like chance and disorder, and kind of describing these two kinds of order as being related to feelings. Which gives me the sense that and maybe this is where my misunderstanding is of entropy, because I don't understand it on like a metaphysical level, and I don't understand like the actual arguments towards it or anything. I just understand it as this vague concept that I have feelings towards. And when I think of it in that way, I can see it as a sort of order. And so, I think a lot of this, like Hunter is saying, and I don't really fully grasp it, but I think a lot of it has to do kind of like with the way thinking about these things makes us feel, and how we kind of end up being trapped by this dualistic notion. And I think in some way he's being critical of the dualism in the process of kind of making this case about these two kinds of order.
So let me read from page 243. This is, at the top he said he has entropy in quotations. I'm not sure what that's supposed to signify. But then a few lines down, he says, essentially it expresses the fact that all physical changes have a tendency to be degraded into heat, and that heat tends to be distributed among bodies in a uniform manner. To me, that sounds like if you take that to the extreme, you end up with heat death. In this less precise form, it becomes independent of any convention. It is the most metaphysical of the laws of physics, since it points out without interposed symbols, without artificial devices of measurements, the direction in which the world is going. It tells us that changes that are visible and heterogeneous will be more and more diluted into changes that are invisible and homogeneous, and that the instability to which we owe the richness and variety of the changes taking place in our solar system will gradually give way to the relative stability of elementary vibrations continually and perpetually repeated. And so, that to me sounds, I don't know if you want to call that disorder. It seems odd to call it order. Maybe it is. Maybe the elementary vibrations end up being a kind of order, but then he also says perpetually repeated. And, perpetual repetition is not a feature of life, right? It is a feature of the opposite motion of life. Because life is about producing the new, not repeating things over and over. And so if you have, at the extreme, you just have this homogeneous, I don't even know what it is, energy field or something like that just has maybe these little fluctuations in it. That seems maybe, I don't know, maybe you don't want to, maybe I don't want to call that disorder, but it does seem to be, it allows me to think of the cosmos as something that is in a high state, a relatively high state of order, and that is tending over time toward a state of absolute homogeneity, or maybe I shouldn't say order, a high state of complexity, and is tending over time to a high state of very low complexity. And low complexity and repetition all seem to be things he associates with not life. And so, that I don't know, again, maybe I don't want to call it order versus disorder, but it does seem to be a kind of death of the universe that is, I don't know, I'm not sure how I would fit that into his view of things. I mean, especially if he thinks of life as an ever continuing welling up of the new, and that it's always happening, it's always going to be happening, and there's always going to be this, I mean, you get the impression that there's always going to be this opposition between these two directions. But if the whole thing is eventually moving toward this direction of absolute homogeneity and heat, I mean, that's what they call it, heat death. Where in there is there room for a life principle or life impetus?
What if life is the thing that's fighting against that? The interruption of this continual process towards homogeneity. I mean, that's what I understood it as life being disorder, and creativity as being this constant fight against order. And so if that's the case, if life is opposing this entropy in some way, and the entropy can be considered as a sort of order, a different order than we've seen, a different order than we usually conceive of, and living bodies are kind of this fight against it, but they're also being driven towards death on some way, like they all eventually die, but the time in which they're living seems to be this kind of interruption from this heat, towards this heat death. Like we're all going to die, and the general kind of direction of the universe is towards the heat death. But the fact that we're living are these consistent, perpetual interruptions against that.
The way that I kind of use to conceptualize it is like the conception of heaven being like this pure everlasting bliss, but where nothing actually happens. And so to me, I guess what I read from at least that portion of the text to kind of reinforce what Travis is saying is that novelty and the richness and the variety of changes or living or organic matter existing, moving towards something of a more, what he calls, I guess, elementary vibrations and perpetual, I guess, repeating of that to where it's indiscernible that anything is happening, is that transition of organic life, which is at its core, I guess, disorder, into order of the inorganic. And that's why, like, I wasn't sure if he was trying to hint at some kind of determinism or finalism. And so that's why this section really kind of confused me. Because I didn't really get anything explicit that hinted at what he was suggesting, what the second form of order was.
I think that one thing that I think Alex, you and Travis, you both have kind of hinted at with what you're saying, that I just want to, because it's a very naive point that I think we're all like assuming is true, and I want to just make it explicit. I think that like the where I'm focused, the thing that I think is my primary attention towards this entropy notion is that why, and maybe he does say it somewhere, and if he does, I egg on my face. I'll eat crow all day, but I don't conceive of this battle between living order and physical mechanical order as being an eternal, permanent, universal struggle of reality forever and ever and ever until the end of time. I don't see that. I can very well imagine that once all subjectivities die, the struggle of life will no longer be the case. But at a certain point, and this is what we've talked about, Nevitt, back when we were talking, we talked about this back when we were talking about The Imaginary by Sartre. We were talking about how, like, what would it be like to imagine the world without people? And it's like, that's a similar question to ask as asking what would it be like to stand outside of space and time? You know what I mean? It's just like, it's almost like a nonsensical question. It's almost incoherent, even though incoherence apparently doesn't exist according to Bergson. I'm just joking. I think that I seriously, I just think that, like, it's not that crazy of an idea to me to imagine that right now, while we're alive as subjects, there is this permanent, constant battle, or I guess not battle, but this oscillation between, or this duality of order in one end of physicality and automatism, and order in the notion of life and vitality and will. I think that that's totally reasonable. And then it's also totally reasonable, and I can easily believe it and imagine it, that duality will disappear once nothing is alive anymore. Maybe I'm misrecognizing or misconceiving of what it means to be alive, but I don't know. I could totally see entropy. That's why I keep saying, that's why I keep, the only way that I can, or not the only way, but a way that I can make sense of it really natively is that our struggle, our notions of order and disorder and chaos and entropy and all this, all of it just exists in a material facticity that is governed by a metaphysical rule of entropy. You know what I mean? And that, for that reason, I think that both theories can exist. But I mean, that just comes up to the question of, does he ever eternalize anything here? Because if he does, I'm blown out of the water. I'm up a creek. You know, I have no leg to stand on. But if he's not, I don't know. Maybe I'm putting words into his mouth.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. My only notion that he's going to at least hint at something, at least from the text, and I may be reading too much into it, is him on 244 basically saying, in reality, the problem remains insoluble as long as we keep on the ground of physics. For the physicist is obliged to attach energy to extended particles, blah, blah, blah. He would belie his role if he sought the origin of these energies in an extra spatial process. It is there, however, in our opinion, that it must be sought. And so that to me kind of hints something that at least there is some part of that process that seeks something, some kind of explanation that isn't necessarily bound to, at that time, what the conception of like life generation was in the universe for physics, you know, in the 19th century.
Yeah, I think he basically says that he's going to talk about it. I think earlier in the chapter, he says that he's going to go into it in the next chapter. But that's definitely, I was about to read that quote that Alex just gave, where he says that part of the problem with, Boltzmann, is in thermodynamics or whatever, is that he seems to basically be saying that for the most part, it's pretty much true, but there's a problem in that physics always attaches energy to extended particles and remains in space, where his role, if he sought the origin of these energies, is an extra spatial process. So I think that's the real key here. And I think to a certain degree, he's going to ultimately say, I think definitely memory has to have something to do with this. And he hasn't really given an exact kind of theory about what's going on with that. All we know is it has a role to play in it. So I think he's basically saying that life is this way of interrupting entropy. And so I think basically the idea of, whether it's an order or disorder, that's kind of like beside the point, because I think this is kind of a way of seeing that these are two different types of orders, that life is that vital order, and then entropy and whatever physical laws you want to think of, that those are a kind of mechanical order. But then entropy seems like a special one, that it's almost like the order in which there's a kind of like crossover with the vital order, because the vital order is always like working within it to try to interrupt it and build something out of it in a kind of reverse direction. So I think if you think of it as so basically, if evolution is working through these different tendencies and these divergences to create, organization, which is a kind of compression of the past into the present, thinking of a future. So there is a kind of increase there in something maybe you call like complexity or something, or just like this in the notion, that life started with these pretty simple, composite unicellular organisms, and now we have basically nervous systems, and we have, like the human nervous system, which has some degree more agency and capacity to like contract the past into the present and think of the future. I think he's going to say that there's something like that which has the capacity to really basically interrupt that entropic process to a pretty significant degree, where it's no longer a simple absolute closed system. And I think that's the thing with entropy, is that it requires a closed system, that if you close off that system, if you isolate it, it will fall apart into, entropic heat death or whatnot. But then if it's an open system, you do have this capacity to kind of have novelty and whatnot. New things are inserted into it. The insert, that's a spatial term. And so when he talks about the infinite universe, what he's critiquing there is that it's a spatial idea. So I think he's going to say his critique, if he's going to, would be more something like the universe isn't closed, but it's not open in a way that's spatial, like the idea of this, abstract space. Instead, it's open in a way that's temporal, and through these. So I don't want to bring in Deleuze's thing that I read later, but so I think he's going to say something about basically, okay, what reality really is time, it's duration, and duration necessarily is a kind of movement of differentiation and of creation. Even if it's a kind of repetition, it's still some kind of creation and difference is going on there. Otherwise, it can't really be anything at all. And so I think he's going to say that, ultimately as a kind of absolute principle, that entropy wouldn't work, and that to consider it an absolute principle would be to basically say that time, in a way, doesn't exist as what he says that time exists as. Although I don't think he's given us here a explicit argument for how he's going to really kind of make this case. I think he's definitely hinted at it, where I think you can kind of, sort of figure it out and put it together. But I think it has to do basically with the fact that, well, basically almost everything he talks about is essentially, don't think of it in terms of space, think of it in terms of time, ultimately. And that's ultimately how he's going to say that, the idea of entropy is actually a kind of reverse thing, because I think he does want to say that entropy is part of this mechanical order, but the mechanical order, the geometrical order, is ultimately actually an interruption of the vital order, which is more has to do with duration. So I think he's going to say that there's some kind of like a reversal there. They're kind of getting it backwards by putting space as is absolute, instead of duration. And duration's just self-differentiation within itself. That's really the property, the movement, the process that is going on in reality for Bergson, I think. So that's the way I see it.
just a couple of responses. So I think, and I don't know if I'm using the word correctly here. This seems to be, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, transhumanist in the sense that he's not, I think like Sartre and some folks, he's not depending on consciousness being the ultimate foundation of reality. I mean, I hopefully you guys know what I mean. I'm talking about in the phenomenological sense, not in the idealist sense. But the reason I say that is because he focuses on the intellectuality and matter are part of the same movement. And then, in the way he talks about animals and so on, I don't think it's merely a matter of the way that the appearance of order and disorder is not merely a matter of the way the intellect works. I think there's a metaphysical thing going on there that's not merely an artifact of consciousness. But yeah, so the stuff that Chase said kind of makes sense to me. What especially in that passage that Alex and Chase read about it's an extra spatial process. So, I mean, one thing it seems, and I don't know physics well enough to say this with any strong degree of confidence, but toward the bottom of 244, when he says, well, this hypothesis is theoretically conceivable, but Boltzmann thinks it's highly improbable. I'm not sure that's true today. I mean, I think today probably physicists would say, this is actually the way we think it's going to go. So I don't think it's as improbable today as he thought it was in his time. But on the other hand, I think Chase's explanation is interesting, especially that passage that Alex read about it being an extra spatial process, and if you think of that as being one of duration. So if I understand what Chase is saying, it sounds like he's saying, or maybe the way I would interpret it, if in terms of thinking that these processes of the Big Bang and entropy and all that are more probable than what Bergson thinks. But even so, maybe you could say that the belief that everything is going to end in heat death and that's the ultimate end of things is nevertheless dependent on conceiving physics primarily in this spatial mode. And then as Chase was saying, that doesn't take into account his notion of duration, because his notion of duration, that duration does not appear, does not show up in a geometrical conception of physics. It doesn't, so it's not in the data. Maybe that's the way I would put it. It's not in the data. And so if you just look at the data that physics has available to it, maybe this entropy is there is only one movement, and that one movement is entropy, and that's all there is. There isn't any other movement. But then it seems like maybe one way to interpret what Chase is saying is, no, there is another movement. It's just that movement is not something that appears in the data of physics because it can't possibly appear there because it's a different kind of metaphysical process. And so you have this other process of duration that is, bubbling up and that is is manifesting as material objects and so on, but you're never going to get that in any kind of physics data that you're ever going to be able to collect. So if you stick just to physics, which is, pure spatiality, absolutely, there's only one direction, one movement, and it's entropy, because this other one is occult in a sense, in the sense of being hidden. And then one thing, if this is the case, and maybe the data, maybe it's in here somewhere and I missed it, I would be interested to know if entropy is the most general term for that one movement, so you've got the life impulse, and then is entropy the most general metaphysical name for that? And that's one question I have. And the other question is, then is materiality exactly what happens when this life impulse and through duration cuts the other direction? is, you know, material objects, is that the result of that, the interaction of those two directions. So I guess, you know, so Chase and Alex have kind of convinced me of that.
Yeah, I think that definitely helps. I think you basically just explained my own thoughts to me better than I was explaining them to myself in my head. But I definitely see that. So I think that would make a lot of sense, especially because look at all the ways that he's making these contrasts, these differentiations between, you know, life and matter and whatnot earlier in the book. So one of the things he talks a lot about how what science and the intellect and, you know, geometry and all this stuff, what it does is it can figure out the degradation of things really well, of decomposing things. You know, he talks about the simple chemical processes and how science is a pretty good idea of how things decompose, but they don't know exactly how that generation happens to begin with. So it sounds like a lot that's what's going on here, just on a basically like a cosmic metaphysical scale, is that I think you'd say, you know, science and Boltzmann and whatnot, they've got that aspect down, that's true, that they understand that decomposition. But the problem is when they think of it only in terms of spatial, you know, extension and whatnot, then they can't even understand that other order. They can only see that other order, you know, as non-existent basically, because they don't understand that time is a reality, because they have this abstract sense of time. So I think he would definitely say that that ultimately, you know, duration is what kind of is ultimately more real, and that entropy is that kind of decomposition of it when you take it as something spatial. But ultimately that's not the whole story. I think I could make some other comparisons with the other ways he differentiates and talks about stuff, because he's constantly saying that, you know, this geometric, intellectual, material aspect it's about interruptions, about putting these discontinuities into the continuity of life and whatnot. So I think he's definitely going to say something like that. So the problem, and this is with like just like the terminology or something like that, but so when he's talking about the two kinds of order and about consciousness and whatnot, it was then I kind of have a hard time understanding that there would be just like a willed order on the total scale of everything, and that the mechanical order would just be kind of like something that just happens to kind of like extend out of that. But ultimately it's the vital order that really is everything, in a sense. That for me was kind of hard to understand as something that's willed, because it's almost like that would basically imply like a kind of, you know, he talks here about like a super consciousness. Maybe that is something like that, but he says, you know, it's consciousness, but it's not like your human individual consciousness. It's something kind of different. So maybe you could think of it as like a proto-consciousness, like a panpsychist thing, but I don't know, it still seems like a bit fuzzy to me. So maybe he just needs to explain it more, or I'm not sure. But yeah, that was kind of my concern ultimately with kind of what he was trying to do with the two forms of order. But I think at least I feel like I understand the entropy part more now that we've talked about that.
The will thing, not surprisingly, I tend to think of in terms of Nietzsche. And then I had the same experience this week that I had a couple of weeks, which was, oh my God, my conception of Nietzsche is just Bergson imported into Nietzsche. But then maybe maybe Bergson got some of this from Nietzsche, I don't know. But so with regard to the proto-consciousness and stuff, the way I think is the sort of metaphysics of the will. Again, this isn't, it's not an obscure view, but there are people that disagree. But if the fundamental metaphysical stuff is will, then that means something like it's sort of almost a Schopenhauerian thing, that there is the fundamental metaphysical ground is a perpetual striving of some kind. And that doesn't necessarily, because this is one of the, I can't remember where it was, where he explicitly says, we're too tied up. One place in here, when he said, well, this is about willing, and I'm like, well, who's the agent here that's willing? But then later, a few pages later, he basically says, now don't get hung up on all this agent crap, that you think there has to be an actor. And so I think of, that he's thinking the way Nietzsche thinks, or Nietzsche's thinking the way he thinks, I don't know which, that that maybe the fundamental metaphysical constituent, as he says, is action. That's what I was looking at. This starts sounding so much like Merleau-Ponty and like Nietzsche. And he says the fundamental reality is action. It's not things acting, it's action, pure action. And so if you think of that, and if that action, and he puts will in quotation marks. So will as something like fundamental movement, fundamental impulse, fundamental movement toward, then you don't have to have, I was like, well, I had the same question for him I had for Merleau-Ponty, is why does he use the word God here? Because that just confuses me, or, makes things more complicated to me than they seem to need to be. But, or maybe I was thinking Whitehead, why does he use that word? But if you just think of the fundamental metaphysical stuff as being primary action, and in a sort of vector action, like action in a certain direction, then you don't have as many of these problems of, well, then who's acting, what's the agent, and all that kind of stuff. And then, Nietzsche, my understanding is he thinks that consciousness is kind of, I don't know, maybe if this is the right word to use, but almost like an epiphenomenon of the interaction of drives and instincts and feelings, which he views as wills to power. So you could think of consciousness as what we experience as consciousness, because, Bergson's really careful to distinguish between human consciousness and whatever this other, quote, consciousness is. But if you can think of, like you said, maybe it's a kind of panpsychism, but in potentiality, conscious things. But then when you get these impulses interacting a certain kind of way, what emerges is what we experience as consciousness. And so if you think of it that way, you don't really need agents, and of any kind. Like he says, again, the way I interpret Nietzsche, he says there are no things, there's just action. And then you get actions doing things in a certain way, and you get the appearance of what appear to be things. And then you get really complicated things, and you get this, what we experience as consciousness, but it's all at the bottom, just this action, this sort of Schopenhauerian striving of some kind.
Yeah, that I definitely see the connection there. So a very young Deleuze, I think he's actually a teenager, he apparently wrote to Bergson and basically said, "You're like Nietzsche." And Bergson was like, "No, I'm not." And at least it was attributed to the fact that, this is basically during World War II, Nietzsche did not have a very good reputation in the French Academy. Bergson was a French gentleman and a Jew, and basically did not want to be associated with Nietzsche at all, even though Deleuze was writing him letters pointing out all these things that were the similarities between him and Nietzsche. But I definitely, I think part of that reason is because of that mutual influence of Schopenhauer. That's a big part of it. Although the way that Nietzsche kind of takes Schopenhauer, away from a kind of idealism, is pretty similar to the way I think you could see in the way that you just pointed out, Nivid, that Bergson is also kind of taking somewhat that idea of like Schopenhauerian will and taking it out of idealism and kind of putting into like a immanent and obviously a much more active temporal idea, because that was Schopenhauer's thing, was the will is this non-temporal thing. And okay, yeah. So the connection with Schopenhauer is basically, Schopenhauer said that, the will to life, it's just the blind will to continue on and to live is basically what's going on with reality. And that there's kind of these other levels that are of a lesser reality, in a sense, almost like I see it as almost kind of like Neoplatonism, where it's kind of like the will is this ultimate unity that transcends time and space and everything. And then there's these kind of, epiphenomenal kind of, what's the term? When you like, something comes out of something else. It's not epiphenomenal. It's not emergentism. I can't remember right now. Whatever, I'll remember. But basically, you have the will, and then you have individuality, which is then this kind of Kantian thing where the mind creates space and creates time and creates the illusion of separateness, when really we're all just this one aspect of the will, of this blind striving to continue and whatnot. So I think there is something kind of like that, in that Bergson is taking this idea of the will, but I think he, instead of saying that it's this non-temporal thing, he wants to say that actually the will is time in some way. And I think he gets to that with his whole sort of notion of all these acts of effort that he talks about with intuition, where it's kind of like this holding of tension and willpower through time. I think that really hints, may not so much as we just simply need to like do these things and then we'll get it. I don't think he's necessarily saying that, but I think we can definitely get a hint at kind of what he's trying to say by thinking of exactly what is he suggesting, like this intuition as a practice would be like. I think we can get a hint from that. And I think based off that, it's definitely something about that will for him is a kind of, is like this dynamic principle of time that is something that connects like the past, the present, and the future. And it's this kind of dynamic differentiation of itself. So I read Deleuze's notes on this chapter of creative evolution, and there's one description he gave of that I thought was really helpful. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. So he's talking about, Elan Vital, consciousness. So he says, okay, so by right, life and consciousness are one and the same. By right, because the duration consciousness identity is explained in this way. We are dealing with duration when the past is gathered into the present and the future is always new. It is this duration that is the condition of freedom and choice, conceived in opposition to relaxation, where moments of time fall outside each other. In effect, in the latter case, there is no longer an organization of the three movements of time, but a pure repetition of the present. It is the very state of matter. So I think it's that kind of glue that connects that flux of time as something that's beyond, just the givenness of the past, or this givenness of a present, or of a discontinuous time. It's that flow within time that you can will through like a presence and a kind of sympathy with that movement of time. I think that's what he really means more by this will. And there's something, and that's kind of also what consciousness is to a certain degree. But I think he definitely, the word degree is very important there, because he wants to put consciousness into degrees. It's not some kind of like ultimate idealist kind of thing. Exactly how he does that and how he's using the word consciousness, I'm still confused about, definitely. But this is at least my initial way of understanding it, I guess.
I think I'm as you're talking about his notion of will, I'm coming back to a certain part in the reading that I guess kind of confused me a little bit. If we can look at it now, I mean, I think that I have a much better understanding of entropy, and I'm starting to understand his notion of will now that we've talked through that. But now I guess I'm kind of selfishly redirecting us towards another problem I have, because I can't understand it. Okay, on page it's 238 and 239. That's where my problem is. It's when he talks about intuition and pure willing. He starts talking all the way from the top of 238. You can see it, an act, but the pure willing, the current that runs through this matter, communicating life to it, is a thing which we hardly feel, which at most we brush lightly as it passes, right? And I have just a laundry list of problems. First, I don't really know what he means when he says pure willing. And then he says, let us try, however, to install ourselves within it. And also, I think there's a typo in my edition that says install with one L instead of two. Install ourselves within it, if only for a moment. Even then, it is an individual and fragmentary will that we grasp. And to get the principle of all life, as also of all materiality, we must go further. He talks about going, is it impossible to go further? There's no durable system that is not, at least in some parts, vivified by intuition. And that's when he starts talking about the history of philosophy as being vivified by intuition. And this topic, this discussion of intuition that he kind of breaks into for a second, I feel like he kind of drops it almost at a certain point. He's just like, oh yeah, intuition's weird and it's hard and it's good. We'll get back to that, and I was unsatisfied. And also, I mean, I guess I'm a little, kind of butthurt, I guess, because he starts talking about dialectic, and it seems like he's not a big fan, because he says that dialectics are necessary to put intuition to the proof, necessary in order that intuition should break itself up into concepts and so be propagated to other men. And so he's arguing that dialectics is this process that takes this intuition, this intuitive mode of being that, Chase, you were talking about kind of exploring, really experiencing, which I can't even think about, and I'd love to, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't even know how to start putting myself into intuition mode. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. But he's basically just in this page, he's arguing that dialectics in a way are a popularization or a codified explication of intuition, and that dialectics as a system will always be transcended and outlived by intuition. In fact, at the bottom of 238, he says, such as, well, actually, I guess I'll start higher up. Intuition, if it could be prolonged beyond a few instants, would not only make the philosopher agree with his own thought, but also all philosophers with each other. So if we were all using intuition, we would all agree with each other. Such as it is, fugitive and incomplete, it is in each system what is worth more than the system and survives it. It's worth more than the system and it survives it. The object of philosophy would be reached if his intuition could be sustained, generalized, and above all, assured of external points of reference in order not to go astray. Right? And to that end, a continual coming and going is necessary between nature and mind. And while I get that he's, so a guided intuition, those are, okay. Well, I want to hear what you mean when you say guided intuition, because I think that what he's arguing here is that like there's a dialectical method in the history of philosophy that tends to codify our attempts at intuition, right? And that intuition survives it and transcends that dialectical method. My immediate thought, right, is that the dialectics that I'm aware of, the dialectics that I've come into contact with, are it's almost like it's as he critiques it, he agrees with it. You know what I mean? He really heavily, immediately agrees with it.
I was going to say that I don't see it as a critique. Actually, I see it as a positive aspect of it. I mean, because in the way that he's talking about it, the relaxation of things and the suspending of things and understanding them better once they're relaxed makes me feel like this intuition that we all have can only be understood in its interruptions, in the moments in which it maybe can be relaxed or moved away from. And so I don't think he's saying that dialectic is a bad thing. I think he's saying that it's a way to understand intuition and to understand the goal, maybe perhaps, of intuition.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Yeah. Yeah. And in that sense, I guess that I would agree. I guess because I think basically what I think that he's describing. I think that, at least again in my experience with dialectics, he's describing this move toward intuition, or I guess maybe not a move toward intuition, but towards the existence of this intuition, which is this guiding universal principle that will make all philosophers agree with each other, apparently, right? I see that as just the modern project of dialectical subjectivities, where Hegel is very clear about this. He says ancient thought was about taking the particular and universalizing it, by taking your being and educating yourself in your particular unique ego and transcending yourself through universalizable knowledge or whatever, right? And Hegel's like, well, now we can't do that anymore. That doesn't work anymore. We're constantly being confronted with universality, and so we impose our subject or our particularity. And he says that our project is the opposite. Instead of taking the actual, our human experience and reaching universality in some way, Hegel's like, we need to take the universal and bring it down here and make it actual, and frankly, I have a very, very loose understanding of what he means when he says that, so don't push me too hard or I'll get scared. But I think that Bergson's notion of, and Chase, I want you to tell me about this guided intuition might be what I'm kind of talking about, is this actualized universality. I don't really know those. So, I mean, please.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I was kind of like half joking about the guided intuition. I was thinking, like, as a group, we could have, instead of a guided meditation, a guided intuition session. So, but basically, I was actually trying to do this when I was reading the book, and I think I got a decent sense of some, yes, exactly, Alex. But see, it's basically you, okay, so I think I will basically, actually, why the hell not? Let's all do a guided intuition. Okay, so basically, first of all, I'm going to read this part to give some context. So on 239, kind of towards the top there, that paragraph, when we put back our being into our will, and our will itself into the impulsion it prolongs, we understand, we feel that reality is a perpetual growth of creation pursued without end. Blah, blah, blah. Manifest spontaneity, bring something new into the world. Where's, so I'm trying to find something that talks about really about the idea of like about tension. Because that's where I feel there's really, that's really kind of the key to it. Okay, so basically, okay, let's practice now. Okay, so close your eyes. Okay, what you're going to do is you're going to, well, first, if you've ever done any like meditation, it's good to, in order to just kind of clear your mind and to like focus on instead on, experience rather than just like thoughts and whatnot, is focus on your breathing first, focus on your body. So you do this first, and then But instead of a relaxation like you would normally do in meditation, instead you're going to tense everything. And this is basically a tension of your body where you get the full sense of all of its capacity for movement. And in that tension of your body, you can sense that you're totally now in this moment of becoming, and that your body can act in so many different ways. There's this multiplicity of possibilities for action. And you do the same thing with your mind in the sense that you can be totally here in the present, but it's not just the present, it's basically a tension with the past melting into the present, melting into the future, that's cutting into it like a razor. And if you feel yourself at the very edge of that razor, that tension, that extreme tension with your body, your mind cutting into that, where it's just like, oh, it's intense. That's basically where I'm getting this intuition. And that's where I can feel that there's something going on there, and that he's trying to get us to see that there's ultimately this movement in time there, and that's what's real, is this kind of, yeah. So I don't think he wants to use the word potential. He uses the word virtual, which is just slightly different for terminology, but I'm not going to get into that because it's way too much. Fair enough. Yeah. So did that help at all? Or is that just, it was fun, right?
I don't know that it's kind of like, it's kind of like when the Tai Chi guy asked me, so did you feel the chi? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know that but then maybe it's again because I have a head like a rock and a dead soul. So I wanted to respond to Hunter's thing about dialectic. I think, so I'm sorry, I don't want to belittle what you said. Do you want to follow that up, Chase? About my dead soul?
No. I think my intuition thing didn't need to be taken that seriously anyways. I'm always just like half joking anyways, so I don't take myself seriously, so you don't have to. So
well, I want to. I mean, I actually want to be able to experience what he's talking about there. It's just I can't. I mean, he may say, well, you have experienced it and you are experiencing it. You're just not recognizing it or something. But I don't. I would like to be able to have that experience and recognize it. So I'm not denigrating at all. It's just I'm not sure I'm getting it.
I guess another.
Did you do it? Did you close your eyes and tense up?
I did.
Oh, well, it worked for me.
Did you guys experience anything?
I
Liked it.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. So I think another way of kind of seeing it is, in like the very first chapter of this book, where he just talks about how, psychology is not of these discontinuous states, but it's like this flow of everything. And if we really pay attention to our mind, we see that everything as a kind of novelty when we pay attention to its temporal element of how it like springs forth into, the past, the future, that there's this kind of tension in time that is this flow. I think it's something like that he wants us to pay attention to. And that's really what time is for him. And that's really what reality is for him. And then I think he's saying basically that's where ultimately our ideas come from also, is when we pay attention to this kind of temporal flow, then that's where we get this connection with reality. And of course it's difficult and I think impossible to maintain some kind of total connection to that. And indeed, in order to even communicate it, you have to kind of get outside of it in order to, go into dialectics. So go ahead.
Can you, I don't know if last week or a week before, I can't remember which, you guys corrected my sense of something. But I was, you know, I had associated with the sort of kind of meditation that Zen does with the wrong thing. But you had, you know, you made a case that that kind of meditation actually does have some connection with this experience of duration. And so that's something I have more connection with. Is there any kind of way you could explain, you know, because my experience in that kind of meditation is really a kind of a mental and physical relaxation, not tension. And, you know, where mental phenomena come and they go and they're just kind of passing through. And I don't have much of a sense of will or activity or striving or anything. So it seems to be exactly the opposite of what he's talking about. But you seemed to make a case the other week or two ago that it was not that much different.
Yeah, so I've basically changed my mind since then. I think it's basically, it has elements of what he's talking about with his tension, but also it has elements that are kind of the exact opposite. So I think more, who's it?
Absorptive.
Sean. I think it was Sean who was talking about that it was kind of the opposite. Well, yeah, you were too also. But so I definitely think that's partially correct. That it's kind of like it's a mix of those two. It's definitely, there's no exact match over there. I think though, kind of, you are, so, you know, normal kind of, let's say just like Buddhist meditation of some generic variety. I think that is definitely kind of using a part of that, of what he's trying to talk about in the sense of there's like a focus and a kind of constant attention, but I think there's also a relaxation within that attention where he's trying to get us aware of like this sense of like the potential for action that is a kind of tension. That's at least what I get from it. And it's so what I think there he's trying to get us to see that there's a kind of like freedom to this stuff. And I think one way of seeing that is like, okay, well, you know, with my body, I can move in all these different ways. And if I get this sense of like a potentiality of, you know, he talks about like these, you know, fireworks and explosions and stuff. If you like feel your body as a kind of like firework that you could like set off at any second, I think that helps me just kind of get the quality of, I think, that the idea that he's trying to talk about. And but it's not, you know, we have to think of these things in like images and ideas and dialectics, but I think he really is trying to point also to the fact that it is kind of this experience of time and of movement, and I guess a kind of energy, maybe he would say, but maybe he would, I don't know, I'm not sure he would say energy, but I think there's something like that going on that he's trying to point to and say that, yeah, it's more of a kind of experience, a feeling, than it is any of these determinate ideas that I talk about.
I think that, like, from my understanding, that relaxation and tension aren't very different necessarily. I see them both as interruptions in a sense towards kind of like real action and processes. I don't know. I can't really explain that beyond that, but I think that, like, for me, the reason why guided intuition thing works is not because I have I feel like I'm closer to my intuition. I feel like, if anything, I'm so cynical of anything like that it all just kind of, I believe in it in a sense because I don't believe in any of it. and I think that that's kind of where I think that, yeah, I guess in a sense it's me purposefully trying to interrupt my cynicism, because the cynicism is universal. It doesn't have to do with the actual qualities of the things, but with kind of a feeling within myself that the reason people are doing these things is not because they really believe it to be true, but because it works out for them in some practical sense. And so I am able to kind of insert my mind into that and believe it's true because I think of it as a very perceptual kind of process of like an exercise, I guess you could say, in a sense. But which makes me feel like that relaxation and that tension, whether or not you see it as one of those things, I think it's still on some level working. You know, I mean, it's taking you out of your understanding of reality in a sense. You know, and even if that isn't necessarily a oneness with self, but maybe a complete separation of confusion of like, I don't know, I'm missing out or whatever, you know, I think that's still a similar feeling to the process of being in yourself and knowing that this process is real or whatever. I don't think they're that far.
Yeah, I understand that. And I have two things. First, I think the thing that I know that Bergson has said that definitely connects the tension and the relaxation that you described, like a very direct quote, is on, it's just a brief line on 176 in a way previous chapter on the bottom of the page. He says, and you guys might have to flip to it, but he says, but it is to the very inwardness of life that intuition leads us. By intuition, I mean instinct that has become disinterested, self-conscious, capable of reflecting upon its object and of enlarging it indefinitely. And that, I feel, is something, at least something similar to, if not directly what's referred to, with the notion of these interruptive sit-downs, these intuitive acts where we try to tense up or we try to do Zen meditation and try to relax. We are grasping at a disinterested instinct, right? Either clearing your mind and washing it out and saying, okay, I'm going to just go down to my absolute bare, raw existence, right? That's a disinterested instinct as far as I'm concerned. And that, much the same, I'm going to tense up, I'm going to sharpen all my senses, I'm going to force myself up to the very lip of time and space where I am. I'm going to be right at the forefront, ready for anything. That's instinct as well. That's a disinterested instinct, if you ask me. Yeah. You know, and that's the first thing. The second thing, actually, which is just something that's interesting, which is what harkens back to what you said, Travis, about like it's an interruption because you're cynical. And yet, sorry, I was scratching my foot. I think that there was a saying about it was a lecture that I was listening to where this guy was like, oh yeah, I was talking to this doctor from Ireland, and there's an Irish folklore tradition that you it's a Catholic thing where you put a horseshoe on your door frame on the outside of your house. You put a small horseshoe on the door frame of your house to keep out some sort of malevolent something, whatever, make you riches, wealth, whatever. It's a good thing to have. And he's talking to this professor, this professor at college, and he says, you have one, and they're walking into his house, and he sees the horseshoe. He says, oh my God, you have one of those things on there? What, do you believe in all that? And he says, no, of course I don't believe. I do not believe, I'm a scientist, for God's sake. Of course I don't believe in a horseshoe is going to make my life better. And he says, well then what are you doing? Why do you have a horseshoe above your door? And he says, oh, well, somebody told me once that it works even if you don't believe in it. So I'm going to keep it on my door anyway. So, you know, and that I feel is this, it doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. I guess if you believe in it entirely and you're just doing this thing you believe in, you're not really trying to confront your intuition. You're trying to codify your life into a sort of symbolic entity that you agree with. You know, you're trying to live the life that you want to live and be the kind of person you want to be. Like, I mean, if I'm a yogi or a hippie, really, like I'll cut to the chase. If I'm a hippie and I spend all my time taking mescaline and trying to trip out with my friends, I'm barely confronting my intuitive faculties. I'm just, you know, engaging with what I think I should engage with, because that's the kind of person that I am or that I want to be or whatever. I'm playing with this realm of experience and reflective immediate symbolic identity and life, and I'm not interrupting anything. Is what I'm getting at. You know, if you don't believe, then this meditative process is a great interruption. You know, and even if you think that it's good for you, but you live your miserable, boring life all the time, and then you get to sit down and kind of chill out or go to Zen Buddhist meditation, or get to tense up for a couple minutes every day, if that's like your thing. It's an interruption. That's the point. You know, which I guess is what I've been getting. I might be misreading or mishearing or misunderstanding.
Yeah, and I think that like I relate to your feeling a lot, Neville, of like going through something like meditation or Tai Chi or whatever, and just not really like knowing whether or not you're really feeling it or relating to it. I guess what I'm trying to say is that me putting myself in scenarios and arguing to myself that I did feel it and that I do feel those things is like a defiance towards me feeling that way. It's like me being upset that I've never really fully related to any kind of process or thing in my entire life. And so I am going to relate to it. God damn it, you know. And I guess that's why I don't see it as very different, because I relate to the feeling, and my actions and my kind of result that I'm getting out of it is just changed because I want to defy that same exact feeling that you felt. So I don't know what that means in terms of any of this, but I just want to say that I relate, and that I think I'm just approaching kind of the situation in a different way. And I think of everything as kind of this joke that has some level of meaning to it.
Yeah.
A while back, Chase, was it last time when I was talking about the chi and stuff, he talked about this aspect of magic where you live.
Yeah, the as if, yeah.
Yeah, and so that when you guys were talking, I was doing this little Tai Chi, or this little Chi thing. So, you know, I was trying to imagine myself, you know, because one of the things Chase said during that exercise was potentiality for action. And so rather than thinking of it in terms of muscle tension, for example, I was trying to think of it in terms of, can I feel, I hate using the word energy in this way because it has all these new age connotations that are mostly bullshit. But this, you know, this sort of potentiality for action in the sense of, you know, feeling, I don't know, like an excitement and energy in my skin, you know, and in my fingertips. And I think that if I was to tell my current Tai Chi instructor, I unfortunately had to get a new one, but that he would say, oh, well, that, you know, maybe that is the chi. So I don't know if it is or not, but I could kind of, you know, feel this sort of energy, for lack of a better term, that is like a high tension potentiality for movement or for action. Not a muscle tension, but something, I don't know what, you know, and maybe it's just nothing but a weird sense of proprioception. But, you know, as Chase was saying, in terms of the as if, you know, I can, you know, maybe that's my closest connection with what Chase was talking about.
Yeah, I definitely think you guys are onto something, and that especially so he talks a lot about the idea of, you know, we have to do violence to our intellect or whatnot. So I think he's like talking to philosophers there, because I think for some people it'd be something very different. Like I have some friends that they will not think what I think we would call rationally. There's like almost like pure, not Bergsonian intuition, but just like caught up in like the sensory like overload of now, and they can't reason in ways that make sense. And I'm trying to get them to like read like basic logic, and like you make no sense. And so they're very opposite, where Bergson, he's talking to, you know, philosophers who tend to be the very opposite. That their problem is to interrupt them is simply to do violence to the intellect, because they're so intellectually based. Where I think a lot of what he's trying to do is he's just trying to get people to be aware of, yeah, we think in everything and the intellect is cool, but we're still these living beings that are engaged in this experiential unfolding reality in time. And he's basically saying, like, that's the thing that we're constantly forgetting when we think and we put things into ideas and think in terms of space and all these different things, that we simply forget that that we're constantly living in time and this unfolding. And I think that's where he's just trying to say, like, go back to ultimately the genesis of our ideas, in the sense that they're approximately accurate to, reality as this movement, as this unfolding of time, that they need to be in tune with that. They need to have some kind of, almost like inspiration from that, or they need to almost, I think of, the way Merleau-Ponty, he would talk about how, like, like this, whatever this kind of flow of life is, that our language needs to kind of like mimic that rhythm of it in some way. And I think Bergson, well, first of all, I thought a lot about Merleau-Ponty when I was reading this, and especially, so Merleau-Ponty, he mainly kind of critiques some of Bergson's ideas, and I was kind of thinking along the same lines that there may be something to critique here along Merleau-Ponty, but I couldn't really remember. I think I've just kind of filtered out Merleau-Ponty. It's almost like a traumatic period of my life where it's like hard for me to even remember. I'm not sure, but anyways, I think also this idea of about belief. I think he wants us to definitely get past like this notion of believing in things and just like center ourselves more on action and experience. So, and I think that's definitely very much in tune with the kind of, I guess, kind of like semi-meditational, experiential ideas that come into play with that. And in terms of, what we're talking about with like, magical ideas, is in that what you do for them is they're necessarily practices, and they're practices as if. So that's a way of basically kind of bracketing out explicit beliefs, is you just act as if, and you have to do the action. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to just like theorize about it. So I remember one description, Aleister Crowley, the famous, black magician or gray magician. But so one person was saying, like, I don't understand. And actually, it's kind of interesting, was Aleister Crowley, his big thing was about the will too, that basically do what thou wilt, that ultimately there's like this higher will that if you can kind of get in sync with that, then that's how magic is done to a certain degree. But this one person was explaining that I just can't understand, what this thing about the will is. And then this guy asked him, like, well, have you done his exercises? Like, his whole thing is about doing things. It's like, no, I haven't. I've just basically have read his books. He's like, that's your problem. You have to actually act. You have to do them and then see what happens. You can't just think these things. And I think he wants to do something similar to this also with philosophy. Instead of, just like thinking and writing and whatnot, that actually philosophy ultimately has this kind of, creative bedrock in our actual experience of reality. And that's where this notion of like a radical empiricism also comes from. And, also I just had to say, like, I think you can see where Deleuze comes out of Bergson also with this whole notion of like interrupting things, that there's kind of like this productive difference that comes about through interrupting habitual modes of living and whatnot. And then there's really a kind of like a social, critical social aspect to this, that, if we constantly think in, one way as, society, we act in one way and we're blind to other aspects, what's going on, that if we have these interruptions and these productive differences that lead to, you know, new modes of thinking or acting in the world, that there's something to that. And that's where I see a lot of possible, like, you know, social, critical, political kind of uses that we could make out of this book, out of creative evolution. And I think that's definitely why the next book he really wrote was The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, where he basically extends this to like a societal thing. So a lot of tangents there, but hopefully that was interesting.
To really go back, so I've just been kind of reading around page 176, 177, 178. It's kind of stark, like how it really does recontextualize for me what he means with intuition, because at 176, at the top paragraph break, the concrete explanation, no longer scientific but metaphysical, must be sought along quite another path, not in the direction of intelligence but that of sympathy. And then he calls instinct sympathy, and then you make those comparisons, and he says at the bottom of 177, thus intuition may bring the intellect to recognize that life does not quite go into the category of the many, nor yet into that of the one, that neither mechanical causality nor finality can give sufficient interpretation of the vital process. Then by sympathetic communication which it establishes between us and the rest of the living, by the expansion of our consciousness which it brings about, it introduces us into life's own domain, which is reciprocal interpenetration, endlessly continued creation. And then further on, 178, he goes talking about into the problem of the theory of knowledge. We shall see that the problem of knowledge from this point of view is one with the metaphysical problem, and that both one and the other depend upon experience. And so I think that really talks about it's not enough to live in your own head and to try to rationalize through scientific thought, that it is an interplay. He even uses imagery of like a circle of one depending upon the other to find common origin, and then using, I guess, the examples of animal kingdom evolution as a way to at least begin to illustrate that point.
I wanted to put some salve on Hunter's butt, because he was butthurt earlier about dialectic. It's kind of related, a little bit related to what Alex just said too. Because I actually agree with Travis when Travis was saying his comments on dialectic are pretty positive. On 238, you know, he says dialectic is necessary to put intuition to the proof. Necessary also in order that intuition should break itself up into concepts and so be propagated to other men. And then down, like 2/3 down the page, in short, dialectic is what ensures the agreement of our thought with itself. And then that passage that Hunter read, you know, there's only one truth. Intuition, if it could be prolonged beyond a few instants, would make all the philosophers agree. But I think the problem is we can't do that. We can't make intuition persist for that long. And so so in order to make anything communicable, you have to have concepts, and you do that through dialectic. And so I think what he's saying is dialectic is essential. And what he's recommending is that we somehow dip into intuition and then come back and engage in dialectics, and then somehow re-grasp intuition, correct that dialectic, and it's just a constant process. And that, I mean, it reminds me, I don't think it's the same thing, but it reminds me of Whitehead's thing about you know, speculating and then seeing whether you're the airplane landing and taking off, then seeing if your speculation matches with empirical reality, and then speculating again. It's kind of like, you know, so you're in dialectics, and then you dip back into the tuition to make sure that your dialectics are, as you're never going to be able to express, as several people have said, you're never going to be able to express intuition adequately in terms of concepts. But since that's the only way we can communicate, you've got to do that. And so I think he's saying dialectic is essential to the process of philosophy. It's not, I don't think he's saying you have to, you know, that the goal is is intuition. I don't think that's the goal, because I mean, I think maybe he would say, like Chase was saying, since philosophers, since we live in our head so much, we kind of have to try to figure out how to do that. And that's a goal in that sense, but that ultimately the goal would be to try to express concepts more and more accurately over time through dialectic, through re-engagement over and over and over again with intuition. So I think he thinks it's actually essential.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, I think, I think Bergson is just kind of warning us against like mistaking dialectic for intuition, and then moving from there without kind of coming back to this original intuition. But yeah.
Yeah. Uh-oh. Oh, you're muted. Okay, that was so confusing to me because I'm using like two screens, and I was looking at you talking, and I was like, why isn't that making noise? Anyways, actually, you want to go? I know it's 4:00. So when I was just reading this, I was trying to really trying to capture this notion that he has of duration as something that kind of so one thing that confused me was, so I tried to make a list of basically his kind of differentiation between space and time, and then that led me to, well, if these are just like a differentiation within like one greater thing, then what is it? And then I was like, well, that's time too. So then what the hell is going on if time, how does this happen? So I think what he's basically saying is that, space isn't a positive reality. It's a kind of disruption of time or whatever. But then I was trying to get a sense of, what is this thing that, by thing, I mean, it's not a thing, this process by which something can kind of disrupt itself or differentiate from itself. And I was trying to imagine it, and I realized that I had these images in my head of these kind of like flowing, like geometric morphing things that I was trying to kind of put words onto. And I noticed, first of all, that they were all spatial things because I couldn't imagine something else. I mean, they were moving and whatnot, but they're all spatial. But then I was trying to describe them, and the only way I could do it was through this kind of poetry that was constantly that was using opposites in conjunction with each other. And it's kind of frustrating to like even try to conceptualize or whatnot, because I was basically reduced to this stuff that I don't know, it's kind of interesting, but I'm thinking at the end, whenever we're done, I would like to read some of this just so we could all laugh together at this stuff that I wrote, which is really born out of frustration more than anything. It's more frustration than revelation, I think. Oh, you want to hear it now? Okay. A focal contraction of resonant intervals, a self-differentiating flesh of ecstatic rupture, an asymmetrical enantodromia, an oscillation of co-constitutive kenosis, a transcendent immanence, an immanent transcendence, a crescendo of resonant contrast, an implosion of exhalation, and deliquescent crystallization of reverberant self-refraction, the dehiscient rupture of self-possession, a recursive revelation of mobile metaphors, an occult sublation within the introjection of extensive disintegration. The productive creative power is a kind of this is where I was talking more philosophically, but the productive creative power is a kind of self-interacting field of rhythmic contrast of asymmetrical resonances and mutual correlations of coherence and decoherence, engendering intensive crescendos into emergent phase shifts of modal expression, a virtual plane of interweaving self-refractions of concrescent potentialities contracting into templexive intensities of transversal cyclo-resonant coherence. I made up some words. Yeah, there you go.
I mean, I didn't understand some of those words, but the but the but interesting, the basic. You know that picture I drew that, well, some of you weren't there, but anyway, when I was trying to explain my conception of Nietzsche's will to power, it was like all these intersecting lines of force, and where they intersected really densely, I said, well, then that is where you get something like a thing. Anyway, that's what that made me think of. Some of those images that you had seemed to be very, like the resonances and stuff like that, seemed to be imagistic. That's the way it seemed to me anyway. They were sort of like imagistic descriptions of how you get things within a differentiated field. That's what it made me think. So we can't hear you.
Oh, I thought, yeah, this is confusing though, like looking at myself here, then I forget that I'm using the microphone here. But anyways, I definitely was I was thinking in terms of music and the metaphor of music and the idea of resonance, and so especially thinking of Marshall McLuhan as this idea of interval resonances, and I was thinking of that and trying to just like capture something about that. But yeah, it was honestly, it was kind of like a frustration more than anything about trying to capture this. And I think I got the sense of, you know, that I'm still able to express something with that, but it's something that's ultimately frustrated. And that's why there needs to be this oscillation between going back into the experience of intuition and duration and whatnot, and then trying to express it, and then trying to like cross-examine it and whatnot. So yeah, but I think that definitely goes with that he's saying, you know, that there is definitely a place for that dialectic, you know, and that it's basically to put dialectic into a dialectic with intuition, with an interruption of the dialectic, you get a kind of vital dialectic in a sense.
Yeah, and you know, he talks a fair amount about poetry in this section. I mean, he uses it more for illustrative purposes, but at least it's clear he values poetry. And so, you know, I think that maybe that's part of, I wonder if he might, not all poetry, but at least some poetry is an attempt to render into language experiences that are not linguistically relatable. And so, you know, so the sort of images, I mean, so when you were talking, I have these images and these pictures in my mind, and sometimes that may be a more effective means of communicating something that is not conceptually expressible.
Yeah, I think, oh, okay, I'm not muted. Okay. I had checked there. So when he does a lot of these images, and I think that's one of the most helpful moments he has when he makes these illustrations and these images. Like he uses the idea of art a lot. Like he talks about, you know, the great mass, like a symphony. I think that's probably where I think that's where I started writing this stuff, is he's talking about a symphony and explaining it that way. And then he also uses this one image of, he's basically talking about this sounded a lot like Library of Babel, of when he's talking about the letters of the alphabet and, you know, the composition of everything that has ever been written. That's basically pretty, but he's talking about that to make some other kind of point. I think that it's not actually what the new does is basically it's not creating new letters. It's creating, new expressions of like within that. And then the image though is the one he uses of the the steam or something like that. What is it? It's like towards the end here. I read like a few pages after the 248 where he's supposed to shut off. Hopefully it's not after that. Do you guys know what I'm talking about with the, oh yeah, oh here it is on 247. Yeah, a vessel full of steam at a high pressure, and here and there in its sides a crack through which the steam is escaping in a jet. The steam thrown to the air is nearly all condensed into little drops which fall back, and this condensation and this fall represent simply the loss of something, an interruption, a deficit, but a small part of the jet of steam subsists uncondensed for some seconds. So that one, I think that's a really good example. I also thought of one with this. So I had this soccer ball, and it let's see, I had this down for sure yesterday. I should have written it down because I've kind of lost this insight since then. I actually had the soccer balls in my room. Hold on, let me show you.
What was Tom Hanks' soccer ball called?
I think that's a volleyball, but Wilson.
Wilson.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, I had okay, also my example is a failure because, so this ball was inflated, but you see where it's torn there? Basically, this part was like prolapsed out of it and it was extended, and it made me think of basically how like relaxation brings like extension. That's what I was really trying to think of, in the sense of, how is it that, tension and concentration is kind of like this new ball that I just got. So this is basically like a perfect intuition right here, is like this concentration, but then still there's a kind of relaxation that brings extension, but it's a complete failure. Don't try to understand it, because this ball went totally flat, so now it's not extended anymore. So there you go. But I was really trying to think of it in the sense of the way that there could be like, there's an entropic force, I guess, that's kind of trying to extend it ultimately to like disperse it. But then there's still, what the ball is a kind of like tension or contraction into its shape, And I was trying to, it gave me at least a sense of what he was kind of talking about, in the sense that there's like a contractive force and then also an extensive force, and that through like a relaxation in the contractive force, which would be this, then you get a kind of extension that is still connected with the whole thing. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I was like about to like go running through the streets, like explain that I understood all of life or whatnot. Not really, but I had it more down yesterday, and today I kind of lost it to the point where I was like, I'm not even gonna bother trying to explain it, but here I am explaining it. So
Well, thank you for trying to break the rock that is my head, and for trying to revive my dead soul.
anytime.
So any last comments about today's stuff?
Oh, I guess we can talk about some of the practical logistics, I guess, of the next seminars. So I wrote that long email, basically just explaining all the thing with the different versions of the Schelling text. So I'm thinking we should probably just go with the longer one, mainly because I didn't realize that the first book is actually pretty short. That because there's a bunch of supplemental text and a introduction and whatnot. So it's actually only the freedom essay. It's only 60 pages long. So, but I think if we read the introduction and we read that essay, and then that gives us time to, if we want, then we can read the supplemental stuff, which seems to be genuinely helpful because it's about the, if you guys know about the pantheism controversy with Spinoza that was going on. Yeah, so it's like a big thing in German idealism that, so basically they're talking about like, what's up with Spinoza's philosophy? Does this like mean that freedom is impossible if you believe in reason or something like that? I'm not totally sure. It was like, what was his name? Jacobi was arguing against, I'm not sure who he was arguing with. I think it was basically like, if you believe in reason, then it ultimately leads to determinism or something like that. And I'm not exactly sure what Schelling does with that, but it seems to be pretty important to what like his overall goal was in talking about freedom. And then there's also a thing from Jakob Burma, which I think I've talked about before, but mainly in relation to Borges, because Borges mentions him. So, but I think he's definitely important there. So there's that, and then so the other book, The Ages of the World, that one is would be 100 pages, and there's also an introduction that's like 15 or 20 pages. I think we should have that part of the reading just so we would then have something like 220 pages, which would mean there's not actually that long of a reading. And then that would give us an opportunity to read whatever commentary we want. So whether it's Zizek or, dare I speak his name, Heidegger.
So there's usually 14, well, maybe it's 13 or 14 meetings, depending on when we start. I just divided 220 by 14 and got 15. If I divided it by 13, it'd be a little more. So that would be like 16, 17 pages a week, which isn't, that's not bad. And then like you said, if we were getting through it too fast or something, we could read other stuff. Yeah.
Because I plan on definitely reading some supplemental material for Schelling, but then also, so with the literature seminar, if we end up reading something like Gravity's Rainbow, we're going to need that extra time because that's going to be something like, I think like 50 or something pages a week.
And that's not, I mean, I haven't read it, but that is a hard book, I've heard.
Yeah. Like some of it, like you talked about like rocket science and stuff like that. But
it's
also
like
a
postmodern novel, right? Which means it's probably impossible to understand.
Personally, I'm leaning more towards the Kafka collection. I mean, obviously we'll decide together, but yeah, just because I've never read any of his stuff.
Yeah, basically, I would be happy with pretty much any of those except the fourth one. What's the like Disgrace? I've never actually heard of that one, so that's why I wouldn't want to read that one because I just don't know anything about it. But I would be fine with any of the other three, basically. Pretty much whatever anyone else wants to do, I'm down with any of those. But
don't let my comment dissuade you though, because I mean I really don't want to have a vote on this text because as I said, I may not be able to participate much. So
although
I was just being snide and
yeah, well, so I think though if we do Kafka would definitely be the easiest. You would probably be able to participate, I think, if we did that. It would still be, we're still reading quite a bit. It would be something like 40, I think, something pages a week, I think. But Kafka is a lot easier to read than Gravity's Rainbow, and House of Leaves also is a little disorienting.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, I don't know. Maybe Kafka is the best thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'm not gonna. Don't ask me for a vote. Okay. Well, it sounds like you guys are working through the planning process well, and like I said, on the philosophy seminar, probably the week before classes start, I'm going to broadcast the first invitation message. So, you guys are independent, but just to give you an idea, that's kind of what I'm shooting for. And I'm just planning on saying, these are the books that we're going to be reading, and you're welcome to join. And this is the time we're going to be meeting, and just ask for people to respond. And do you guys have any, let's see, do you guys have any idea whether you would be available on Tuesday or Thursday afternoons or sometime on Friday? Or is it too early to know? No way to know yet?
I think I would be able to, but so basically I have no job, I have no school right now. Like basically my life is just like doing these seminars and doing reading groups on Discord, where I'm doing like 4 or 5 right now. Like I have one in an hour. I'm doing like a Heidegger one, but that's basically what I'm doing. So my schedule is set around these seminars more than anything. So that's where I'm at.
Okay. Well, I will take these. See, Alex gave me some schedule information. So I might query you again when we get closer to the time. So
Yeah, it's so Tuesdays or Fridays, you said?
Tuesdays afternoons, Thursday afternoons, or anytime Friday. Those would be easier for me because I have classes Wednesday afternoon and Monday and Wednesday afternoon, Tuesday and Thursday morning, but then I have Fridays off. So
yeah, so if it was Friday at this time would continue to work for me. Tuesdays would work, and yeah, Thursdays would definitely work as well.
So you're pretty good then. Okay, well, anything else? Nope.
Now that I think about it, pretty much every day works for me.
Great. Hasta la vista, baby.
All right, see y'all.